Welcome. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. We are going to be discussing reserve fundamentals, and particularly understanding the new SB 40 law and structural integrity reserve study requirements. Joining me on today's webinar is Howard Perl, who is a shareholder with Becker Lawyers, and Jason Kubus, who is a principal and professional engineer with Custom Reserves. As you are all aware, SB 40 was recently passed during the special section of the legislature to address condominiums and co-ops in terms of the structural preservation of their buildings. This is a reaction, obviously, from the unfortunate instances at Surfside. And keep in mind that this bill was passed. There are still a lot of unanswered questions. We will attempt to answer some of them today. There's some of them that are still going to be needed to be fleshed out, modified, have more information specified. From what I'm hearing, and Howard, when we turn it over to you in a second, you can give a little more background, is we expect in the next legislative session to have some of the issues that need to be clarified, taken up, and hopefully given some more distinct information about it. So to give an overview of first of the law and then how it relates to the buildings, I'm going to turn it over to Howard, and then we'll go into the structural reserve study part of it with Jason. So Howard, if you would give us an overview.
All right. Good morning, Doug. Hello, everybody. And Doug, thanks for asking me to participate. Jason, nice to see you all. We could probably spend all day talking about all this stuff, but I don't think we have that much time. So basically, I'm just going to go over the big points. The two key mandates for the new law involve engineering inspections and reserve studies and reserve funding. There's something that's now called a milestone inspection, which means a structural inspection of a building, including load-bearing walls and the primary structural members and systems of the building. That's something that's new. This inspection must be done by a licensed architect or engineer. There are two phases to this milestone inspection. Phase one is a visual inspection of the building by a licensed architect or engineer. If they find there were no signs of substantial structural deterioration to any of the building components by just a visual inspection, then that's the end of the inspection, and phase two is not required. A phase two inspection is required if on the visual inspection they find any, in their opinion, substantial structural deterioration during the phase one inspection. And this phase two inspection can involve destructive testing or non-destructive testing at the inspector's direction. In other words, if they want to chip away some concrete to see what's underneath there, they have a right to do that under a phase two inspection. If they want to take some core samples, they have a right to do that under a phase two inspection. The phase two inspection can be as extensive or as limited as necessary according to the inspector. The other thing that's going to be required moving forward is called a structural integrity reserve study. And this means a study of the reserve funds required for future major repairs and replacement of the common areas, also based on a visual inspection. The structural integrity reserve study can be performed by anybody who's qualified to write or prepare these reports. But the visual portion of the structural integrity reserve study must be performed by a licensed engineer or architect. The report itself doesn't have to be written by a licensed engineer or architect, but the visual part of that inspection must be completed by a licensed engineer or architect. Associations are going to have these structural integrity reserve studies completed at least every 10 years. And it's for buildings that are 3 stories or higher in height. And it includes the things you're used to seeing in a regular, statutory reserve or reserve study, your roof, electrical, but the waterproofing. But there's some new things that are added, some that are a little bit controversial, as Doug alluded to. So it also includes floors, foundations, I don't know. I'm not an engineer, but I always thought foundations were supposed to last forever. Fireproofing and fire protection systems and windows. And again, we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but windows can be problematic. What if the windows are the owner's responsibility? Also, anything over $10,000, the failure to maintain would cause a problem with the above. This goes into effect as of January 1st, 2025. So as of January 1st, 2025, associations will no longer be able to waive funding of reserves at all, and the association membership will not be allowed to vote to use reserves for other than intended purposes. And the most important part, or one of the most important parts of the Structural Integrity Reserve Study, is that the statute provides if an association fails to complete such a study, it is considered a breach of the officer's fiduciary duty to the unit owners. So that's pretty significant. That was probably a little bit longer than you wanted, Doug, but that's what I came up with as a brief overview of the main provision.
Yeah, Howard, I'm going to ask you to put on your crystal ball for a moment. And as you said before, and as I mentioned, that there are a lot of items in this law that need to be clarified. Do you see, or what, can you give us any insight as to where you see maybe the legislature going in the next session to kind of explain some of these? And one of the things I'm also getting questions on from our clients and from other buildings, everybody, when given a deadline, one of the first questions they go is, oh, it's going to be extended, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if you could put on, as I said, your Karnak turban for a moment and give us maybe some insight into that.
Well, I was going to make a reference to Karnak, but I figured I would be the only one that would get it. So along those lines, I'll tell you that my answers were sitting in a mayonnaise jar on Pumpkin Wagnall's doorstep for the last 24 hours, for those of us old enough to get all of that. But I would have given you a different answer 2 weeks ago than I'll give you today. And obviously, we all know what happened, in the last 2 weeks with Hurricane Ian. And the reason I say that is, you say, well, what's that got to do with the structural reserve integrity and all this kind of stuff? I think the legislature is going to be really preoccupied this upcoming session with insurance-related issues. As you can imagine, what's happened on the West Coast is a disaster, not only for the people involved, but it's going to be a disaster for the insurance industry, and it's going to be a disaster for any association and probably any unit owner trying to get insurance moving forward. I think that's going to be a big part of the upcoming legislative session. All right, so I just want to put that out there. Having said that, I work on a couple bar committees and real probate and trust law committees, and we are working on, glitch bills, if you will, to address some of the issues in here. I know there is a group and there are people who are looking to phase in, or as you say, extend out that December 1st, 2025 reserve requirement. Look, I certainly can't tell you what the legislator is going to do. In my personal opinion, I don't see them stretching that out any further. I think they'll have other issues on their plate that will preclude a significant or substantive discussion on that issue. And I think they'll just say, well, it is what it is, deal with it. Some of the other things that need clarification are, this structural integrity reserve study requires that there be a reserve for the foundation of the building. And again, I'm not an engineer, but I always thought the foundation of the building was supposed to last forever. And how do you repair a foundation of the building? And how do you reserve for the foundation of a building? Load-bearing walls, another example. And the windows are an example. I think it needs to be tweaked, in some of these regards. I wouldn't be surprised if some of that is tweaked. Like I said, there are several committees working within the Bar Association that is looking to tweak that a little bit. But as far as an extension, I wouldn't hang my hat on it. And I would start preparing now for that to be effective as of January 1st, 2025.
Terrific. Thank you. And I think that's a great segue. As you said, with foundations, we'd have to ask an engineer, and lo and behold, we have one. So, Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you from the engineering standpoint. If you would first, just to give an overall viewpoint from yourself as both an engineer and also as a firm that does reserve studies on how this is going to affect the associations in terms of retaining a reserve specialist. And then if you could please go into, as Howard mentioned, some of these line items that are now added to this that the associations have a little bit of a difficult time understanding how that's going to be treated in the actual studies.
Great. Yeah, absolutely, Doug. Thanks for your intro there. Quick background. I am a licensed professional engineer. I've been doing reserve studies full time since about 2006. I also have a design firm on the side. And so I do a little, I kind of cross train, if you will. Reserve studies is my primary focus, but some engineering design work as well. This is definitely the first in the 15, 16 years I've been doing this, very momentous change that is taking place here. And to kind of jump right into it, I've literally got the Senate Bill 4D pulled up on my screen. If you want to look at it, it's an 88-page document. Page 37 is what I'm going to be referring to as I go through some of these items. Many things to discuss, but to go right into your question about discussing some of the main points. Here are what they are telling us as reserve study providers that are going to be doing structural integrity reserve studies, what we shall include in our reports. Roof, load-bearing walls and other primary structural members, floor, foundation, fireproofing and fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical systems, waterproofing and exterior painting, windows, and as Howard mentioned, any other item that has a cost that exceeds $10,000 and failure to replace or maintain would negatively affect any of the previous items I just mentioned. So that's all of it out there in one shot. Some of these things are things we've always included ever since I started as a young engineer doing reserve studies. We've always included them. Prior to this change, the Florida statutes required 4 different things: roofs, painting, paving, and anything over $10,000. Without the stipulation, I believe that failure to maintain them would negatively affect. It was just $10,000 or above needs to go in there. So like elevator cab finishes, for example, not a structural component, but we would put those in there because they could cost $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, depending on the decorative level of the cab finishes. Now we've added, or they have added, some significant items: load-bearing walls and primary structural members, floors, foundations, windows. As Howard mentioned, are the tricky ones. Roofs, we've been doing that all along, no problem. Fireproofing, fire protection systems, somewhat we've been doing all along. Fire panels are a typical component. Your emergency pull stations and enunciators in the hallways or the breezeways on a high-rise style building, those have always been something we've included. Fireproofing, that part of that particular line could get really, really detailed and into things that you can't visually see. So therefore, or therein lies a problem, because this whole structural integrity reserve study is based around a visual inspection. It's actually stated as such in the Senate Bill 4D. So if it's something that's supposed to be visually inspected, but you can't see it, there's a paradox that has been created there. So you've got these types of new components, and to talk about the foundations, for example, right, the foundation is what we would call an indeterminately long useful life, and as well indeterminate replacement costs. You can't replace a foundation without replacing a building because the building will fall down. I think anybody, you don't need to be an engineer to know that. I think, and this is where we need some clarification from the state. Hopefully we get that. What do you mean by foundation? They literally put the word foundation and a period. That's it. No description as to what they're including. Are they talking about looking at the plans, possibly anticipating what type of geotechnical bearing capacity the soil beneath the slab has, and then making a recommendation that say in 10 years, it's likely that the northeast corner of your foundation is going to need to have some mud jacking done to lift it. These are things that we could use some clarity on in the engineering and in the reserve specialist, professional reserve analyst, reserve study provider world. We just did not get that with this initial draft. Hopefully that's what it is. It's a draft and it doesn't become the final without some revision. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of the structural integrity reserve study requirements, and how we include some of these components. Many of them are stuff we've already done. Windows are something we could include fairly easily because it's visually evident how many windows there are. You have a 10-story building, we can look at the plans and say, okay, you have 85 windows that are 6 feet tall and 5 feet wide. This is the replacement cost to put new impact glass per code into a high rise. Do we want to put $7 million of windows into a reserve study as a common element, which is what a reserve study is for, common elements only? If the windows are, by the declaration and bylaws and articles of the association, the responsibility of the unit owner. What if a unit owner just replaced their windows and their sliders and their patios for $40,000 to get the creme de la creme brand new windows, and all of a sudden they get a special assessment for windows because now we're putting them in as a common area component in a reserve study? That again creates a paradox and a discrepancy. So these are the types of things that we're waiting on, hopefully getting in after the regular session of the legislature, which I believe is January through March of 2023. And coming out of that, hopefully we get some information. And as Howard mentioned, because of the hurricane, this may, I don't want to say take a back burner, but there's more urgent things most likely that need to be taken care of here because of that hurricane. So we'll see what happens and we'll go from there.
And Jason, you bring up a couple of points that I want to delve into a little bit. And, and again, we're all waiting on some clarification, but barring that, do you see your occupation as reserve specialists and now having to do with structure? Do you see instances where, let's take foundations, for example, where as an engineer, you're going to say to an association, look, I see some things. Do I want to go further and do some either destructive testing or borings for a foundation, let's say? Or are you going to take the tack that should be covered? And Howard, you may want to join in on this too. Is that covered more for the milestone than the structural reserve study?
I would say for the clearest way to describe this is during a milestone inspection. Let's just say a high rise gets a milestone inspection and a structural integrity reserve study done in the same month. Okay, they bring out the milestone engineer to do that first. I will absolutely take a look at that report because what a milestone inspection is, in a nutshell, that is a instantaneous condition assessment of the building. If there's something that is visually evident right then and there that needs to be fixed, that's what a milestone inspection is going to catch and capture, and that's what it's meant to do. The milestone inspection has nothing to do with future forecasting of reserves. That's where the structural integrity reserve study comes into play. Conversely, you could say the structural integrity reserve study really is not meant to be an exhaustive remediation document for the instantaneous condition of the building. We have to assume that those, if there are cases of substantial structural deterioration evident at the time that we do our structural integrity reserve study inspection, we have to assume that those will be remediated before we forecast the life of that component. So for example, if we see, if I go out there to do a structural integrity reserve study and during my inspection, I see that there are significant 1/4-inch step cracks through a block wall in the parking garage. I'm not going to just turn a blind eye to that, obviously. We can't do that as engineers in general. So I'm going to address that in our report. But the idea is that we note, we saw this XYZ condition defect or just we don't call it defect because that's not really a defect, but just a condition that represents something that needs to be repaired now. Once we get that handled, and that could be captured by a a vendor coming out to do whatever repairs that need to be done. Then we forecast what the useful life should be for that component beyond the fix once it's done. So long story short, the phase one milestone will capture things in the moment, things that need to be fixed now, things that could lead, with unchecked, could lead to some kind of catastrophic failure. That needs to be fixed now, first and foremost. Then the reserve study, the structural integrity reserve study, will pick up where that leaves off and forecast what should be funded annually to make sure that there's adequate funds and reserves to make sure that these things don't happen again. In terms of, it could be waterproofing, like, we paint every 6 to 8 years, caulking, sealants, expansion joints, all that stuff needs to be, reserved for, so that you don't get to a point where you have to spend $400,000 on a concrete restoration project because you went 25 years on a coastal high-rise made of concrete without doing any significant waterproofing of the building. So that's where the two things, they kind of work in tandem. One, the milestone inspection is in the now, in the present, the structural integrity reserve study being something that keeps it in good shape moving into the future.
You brought up a good point, Jason, and I think one of the things for associations to think about is how that milestone will help your reserve specialist in doing the structural study for the reserves. It dovetails, as you well said, it dovetails together. So would you recommend in that case that a building getting ready to start looking at doing these things, potentially do the milestone inspection first, then followed by you guys coming in and doing the structural reserve study?
Right. In many cases, most reserve study providers, more than a good majority of them will say, in Florida, are not professional engineers. So they actually have to do that by code. As Howard mentioned, the visual inspection portion of a structural integrity reserve study does have to be completed by a licensed professional engineer in the state of Florida, or an architect as well. Most architects, as far as I've talked to and spoken with, they're not really in the business of doing structural studies. That's not really their wheelhouse. So it's probably going to be structural engineers that do this, if and when they have time, because most of them are very busy. But the idea is that I'd say yes, if you have, for example, a reserve specialist or a PRA, two of the designations I have, that doesn't qualify me to do a structural reserve study, but the PE does. So if you don't have that, you're going to have a PE involved. So there's going to be, moving into 2023, and then obviously up until the end of 2024, there is going to be a huge levels of partnerships forming in Florida that we've never seen before. And to answer your question, yes, I think that if I felt like I wasn't, or if I didn't have a PE and I was not able to do legally the visual inspection portion of a structural integrity study, the first thing I would do is go and find myself, as a reserve study provider without a PE, I would go and find myself a good structural engineer that I could trust to go out and do, maybe weeks or a month ahead of me in advance of my inspection, their assessment for the milestone inspection, and then take the results of that milestone inspection and integrate that into my structural integrity reserve study, which would be completely to code at that point, because like Howard mentioned, it does say in Senate Bill 4D that structural integrity reserve study report, anything but the visual inspection portion, can be done by anyone that is qualified to do so. And I personally, they don't really specify what that means, but I would say that if you are a reserve specialist and or a PRA, one of the RS is a reserve specialist. That's a designation that comes from Community Associations Institute. And the PRA is a similar designation that comes from APRA, which is the Association of Professional Reserve Analysts. If you have one or both of those, I'd say, and again, I'm not the judgment, and I'm not the one to make the judgment call on what that means, but I'd say that you're well equipped to at least do some kind of a low level, maybe a low rise or a mid rise high condominium, just because you have any designation, regardless whether it's a PE, a PRA, or an RS. If you don't have the experience and the know-how, you shouldn't be doing anything anyway. So that's where your history of work comes into play in that point when you get into 40, 50-story buildings. So that's what I would say. Yeah, go start with your milestone. Your structural engineer or your structural integrity reserve study provider is going to need that if they aren't capable of doing the inspection on their own. So it's better to start with the milestone and then do the structural integrity study after that.
Jason, let me ask you a question, if you don't mind, Doug. Again, with what's going on the West Coast, and like you said, the fact that most reserve study companies don't have licensed engineers or architects, and they're going to obviously be reaching out to these folks. I can see that being a real problem over the next 6, 8, 12 months because of all these guys going over to the West Coast to deal with all those issues over there. How do you think you guys might be able to deal with that?
That's a really good question. Even before the hurricane, which was just a week or a couple of weeks ago, I've been speaking with many structural engineering firms specifically about how they're handling the milestones, and I've already been told by several major firms in Florida that they're extremely busy with non-community association work already. This was pre-hurricane, okay? And it's, to be frank, it's much less risky to go and do a structural design for a big box store, like if somebody's building a Walmart, or something, or a Publix. They can go do structural engineering studies for that, or design for that, and not have this liability of life safety as much as they will in the condo world. So they've already got work that's less risky. They may not be comfortable working with condominiums, and maybe there are some that do, but just the fact that they're already extremely swamped with work throughout Florida before the hurricane is even going to make this worse, because now you have the hurricane, right? And the disaster cleanup and the rebuilding and the redesigning and the repairs that need significant structural engineering design work. That's just going to further take away from what we're going to call the bandwidth of professional design capacity or professional engineers in general. One of the things that has changed drastically is that up until now, reserve specialists and PRAs have been able to do reserve studies throughout Florida. Anything from a mobile home park to a townhouse to an HOA, CDD, mid-rise, low-rise, high-rise condos. Now they're pretty much taken off the chessboard, if you will. Aside from HOAs and CDDs and mobile, anything under 3 stories that's not a condo or a co-op. And so that further reduces that bandwidth capacity that I mentioned. So I think we, in the group of reserve providers, we've gotten together and we've discussed a lot of these things. I think we came up with something to the tune of 16,000 condominiums associations, not front doors or units, but 16,000 associations in the state of Florida. There are 3 stories and above. You've got something like 35 registered, 35 human beings that have an RS and a PRA, and maybe of those 5 or 6 that have a PE as well. And that's in the state of Florida in its entirety. It's extremely the demand is outweighing the supply in terms of our ability to get to all these condos by the end of 2024. Effectively, let's just say everybody's busy, the holidays are coming up. Let's just say we've got 2023 and 2024. That's 2 years for a handful of people that are qualified to do these things to get 16,000 studies out the door. I move at a pretty quick pace. Myself alone, I could probably do, if I want to roll my sleeves up and work like a young man again, I could probably do 100 in a year, okay, by myself. Now, there's 16,000, and that's me working like a dog, right? So where the work is going to, where the design professionals or just the professionals, the PEs, where they're going to come from, we don't know. And that's one of the things that our little group, we've put together a letter. We've discussed this, amongst ourselves, and we put a letter out to the legislature. And that's we've actually requested a deferral by at least 3 years. One, for the sake of getting it done in time, And two, for the sake of the homeowners who are going to have to be funding all of these new reserve requirements without waiving, without partially funding, instead of giving them 2 or 3 years to ramp up their reserves to become fully funded, give them 4, 5, 6 years to get that done. Again, the further you kick that bucket or kick that can down the road, the more potential for something disastrous to happen in that extended range of time. So, as Howard mentioned, will they defer this deadline? We don't know. It may seem less likely than more likely at this point, but we're hoping that they can do that at least for the owner's sake, to try to soften the blow financially.
Okay, one of the things too, before we continue, I just wanted to mention to our attendees, if you do have any questions for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A section, and we will be getting to them shortly. Howard, one of the things that is silent in the bill that we've gotten questions on is two things. One is, can we use the same firm to do the milestone and the reserve study? That's question number one we've been getting. And question number two is there's been no time frame listed in sense of when can we do these? Can we do these 2 years before, or does it have to be within 12 months of the deadline of January 1, 2025? As the bill is silent on that, do you see that changing, or it can be done at any time between now and January 1 of 25?
Excuse me, and you're right, Doug, the bill is silent, but I see no issues with associations doing those studies now if they can, obviously, as long as they comply with the statutory requirements. I know, a lot of associations get reserve studies, on a regular basis, or maybe they have a reserve study and it gets updated, every 2 or 3 years off of the base reserve study. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm telling my clients, if you're gearing up for a reserve study, or even if it's for a review or an update of an existing reserve study, talk to your reserve study company and have them make sure that that update is going to be in compliance with the new law. This way you're ahead of the game. And, as Jason and I have both mentioned, getting people to be able to do this work, period, is going to be a real issue moving forward. And if you're able to have your professionals do that now, I don't see a problem with that at all.
Yeah, and I think I'm telling people the same thing in the sense of, make sure if you're going to do your updated reserve, if you're doing it on, as you said, on a cycle, and you're going to be doing it now and updating an existing, again, make sure that the new one is going to comply. And make sure that the reserve specialist company that you're using has the qualifications under the Senate bill to be able to perform the structural part of it. Very, very
important.
And
before Jason jumps in, because I see that look in his eye, I also want to add, to answer your first question, do I see any problem with the same company or firm performing the milestone inspection and the structural integrity reserve study? And again, the statute is silent, but if whatever company is doing the work, if they're qualified to do both, I don't see any issues with that. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any conflict or why that would be an issue. I don't know, Jason, if you have any other thoughts on that.
Right. Yeah, I think I would say that would be the best way to go, right? Because it's kind of like getting 2 different vendors to do something that one vendor could do, right? They're both going to charge you mobilization. They're both going to, if you're going to get a roof, you have 2 roofs on your building, one on the left, on the east building, one on the west. It's like bringing in a roof vendor do one and then another vendor do the other. They're both going to charge you mobilization and time out of the office. Why not get it all done by one? It's difficult to find that. I've already discussed with a couple close colleagues of mine that do structural inspections and evaluations in the milestone side as a way to team up and pair up to do these in tandem under one report, one letterhead, so that we can avoid having to charge twice as much, right? We're still going to have to charge for one study. They're independent of each other, but as much as we can save the client, that's what we're going to try to do here. If we can send one guy out to do both inspections, and then the other guy writes the report from the office, that saves man hours in the field, right? It's a good way to go. So I would suggest, to any owners out there, or boards, if you will, or managers that are trying to get this done in time, start soon, because, for example, we're already on we have a waiting list going into mid 2023 already for structural integrity studies. One thing we are doing is, and this is just our approach from a business side of it, is if we absolutely want to get this structural integrity study done before the end of the legislative session, where we are hoping to get our clarification that we need, we can do that. But it's going to include a lot more risk dollars, if you will, in our fee, because we don't know exactly what we're supposed to do yet. And we don't want to do that. So what I'm telling clients is, if you really want to get something done, get a regular reserve study done now. We as a firm will honor the fact that you got a reserve study done now at a regular standard reserve study price, right? And then once we get this clarification, say post March or into April 2023 and beyond, that still gives us a year and 3 quarters to get your structural integrity study done, at which point we will subtract our fee from the structural study, basically the fee that we would charge for our normal reserve study update. We'll take that off the price of the structural study. So at the end of the day, condos will still realize the same expenditure for our fees, but you're actually going to get 2 different reports. You get a regular study now, and then a year or a year and a half later, you'll get a structural study, all for the price of a structural study. And that's kind of how we're doing it, because what we're trying to do is, like I said, we know insurance prices are going up. You're now having to pay for fees for 2 different products that you didn't have to pay for prior to May of this year. And then you're not allowed to, as an association, partially fund or completely waive reserves after 2024. So it's like a trifecta of expenses, all hitting our clients at the same time. So what we're trying to do is alleviate that as much as possible, but still making sure we check the box for them, again, as Howard mentioned, so that we are keeping them away from that risk of fiduciary violation. And so that's kind of what we're doing. I really don't feel comfortable doing a structural integrity study as of today without some clarification, but we still want to be able to keep the ball rolling in the direction it needs to go.
Also, one of the things too that I want to remind associations and board members is record keeping, because one of the things that is going to be paramount to both the milestone and the structural integrity is, what has your building done recently in terms of any structural work or improvements, and to keep those records and make sure they're given to your milestone engineering firm and your structural reserve study, so they have the background of your building. It's simple to say, oh, I think we did some concrete restoration a couple of years ago. It's very important that they know what was done a couple of years ago, so that, number one, they can take it into account with doing the reserve portion and reserving dollars in terms of line items, but also if they see something in their milestone inspection or even in their reserve study inspection where something's failing, and hey, this was done 2 years ago and it started to fail, we should talk about that. So again, good record keeping for any past projects that you've done that would be considered a structural or an improvement or anything like that to the building should be kept and should be given to your professionals when they do these. I think at this point we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'm going to open that up and go for that. We have a first question is, I am the president of a small 2-story condominium with a total of 18 units. First question is, are there any new requirements for this condominium association? Howard?
Howard, I think you're muted.
I was on mute. I gave the whole answer on mute. No, I'm just kidding. if I'm not mistaken, I'm going to pull it up while I have it right here. I'm pretty sure the milestone inspection is a condominium of cooperative building 3 or more stories in height. I would say that. And I believe the same thing applies to structural integrity reserve study. But again, I'll give the question or the advice I would always give: check with your association attorney, because even though things are pretty clear, I think in regard to that, if you ask 2 attorneys for an opinion, you'll get 3 opinions.
Right.
So check with your association attorney, but I think that's a proper answer.
Mhm. Also, the other question was from this same attendee, and when we have our next 50-year required structural and engineering recertification, will that engineering inspection company need to include inspections on any additional building components?
Well, if you're asking me what's going to be required 40 years from now, I have no idea.
I think it brings also a good point, and I've gotten this too, is, and let's take it even away from this board members association in terms of, and let's assume that they were in a 5-story or a 10-story or whatever. One of the things that we've been discussing is municipalities have their own, up until now, have had their own recertification requirements, particularly Broward County and Miami-Dade County, and then Palm Beach County recently, before this bill, had instituted their also recertification. We've spoken to quite a few of the municipalities and the AHJs out there, and they're basically saying they're working feverishly to amend some of their requirements to tie into the new Senate bill, so that it clarifies as to the milestone, which again, and Howard, correct me if I'm wrong, is a state mandated inspection.
Correct.
As opposed to, let's say, a Miami-Dade 40-year recertification.
Correct. I mean, I think a good generalization is a milestone inspection is basically extending, in very general terms, the Miami-Dade and Broward County 40-year inspection requirements to the entire state, just under the state mandated provisions.
Right. But I think also what associations should do, keep an eye out for your own municipality, is how they will going to be dovetailing into this milestone, and have your engineer very familiar with not only obviously the state requirement for the milestone and the structural reserve, but also any local requirements that have to be as well. And one of the things that we didn't really talk about, which is there are certain, and we won't go into it in detail on this venue, but there are certain time frames involved if there's certain things are discovered under that phase 2 milestone inspection, such as when you have to do work by, if the phase 2 shows that you have structural deficiencies, things like that. So, and this is something that associations should go over with whoever they're going to retain to do this work, because then it comes into not only the bandwidth for doing the actual milestone in and of itself, but also the bandwidth to take it further if you have deficiencies, to then be able to do bidding documents, plans, specifications within those timeframes. So it's something that you need to really consider with your engineer when you talk with them about the milestone inspection.
And the other things I think you want to include in that, Doug, is, if repairs are required, is funding.
Correct.
You may have, and again, let's say these repairs are supposed to be made within a year, for argument's sake. Like you said, by the time you get your bid specs prepared, send your bid packages out and get proposals for, significant concrete restoration, that could be a 3-month process. All right. And the bids come in at X amount of millions of dollars. And honestly, most associations don't have that kind of money in reserves. So then they need to decide whether they're going to special assess, go out for a loan, whatever the case may be. Getting a loan takes a month, maybe, or 2, passing a special assessment, collecting money. So even if there is a year to get the work done, keep in mind funding and how you're going to fund that, and think about that in the planning process.
Right, you bring up a good point, and one of the things that we've been talking to our clients about, because obviously we're right smack dab, in the middle, getting towards the end of budget season, is one of the things that we've been speaking to clients about is don't wait for the shock to come in for the 2025 budget year. Most associations do have a current reserve study, or one that's fairly current. And maybe you should think about starting to reserve more for 23 and 24, so the potential shock is not as great in 25.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. We're telling our clients the same thing, especially, fortunately or unfortunately, whatever side of the ball you're on, there are a lot of associations literally with no reserves. I mean, they vote year after year to waive reserves, and when something is needed, they need a new roof, they need to paint, they pass a special assessment. And if that's the way those associations want to operate up until, January 1st, 2025, that's their decision. But come January 1st, 2025, they are going to have to fully fund reserves. And let me just describe for the people that are on the call, on the seminar, what we mean by fully funding reserves. That doesn't mean that all the money has to be in the bank to do everything that needs to be done as of January 1st, 2025. That means your reserve schedule based on the line item replacement. In other words, if you got 5 years left on your painting and you should have 50,000 in your painting, and you got to collect another 50,000 over the next 5 years to get 100,000 to pay for the paint job in 5 years, and you should have 50,000 there now. Well, as of January 1st, 2025, in that budget, you're going to have 50,000. Whatever that time frame is for each individual line item under regular reserves, as well as the structural integrity reserves, you're going to have that money. So as you were saying, Doug, rather than wait until the 2025 budget year for those associations that routinely, waive full reserves or partial reserves, if you're going to be in the hole in 2025, break that up into 3 chunks.
Exactly.
Pass a third of the chunk in 2023, a third of the chunk in 2024. And then, as you mentioned, once 2025 runs around, you're only having to take a third of that hit as opposed to 100% of that hit. And another thing we didn't discuss, I just want to mention real quickly about glitches. There are a lot of associations that have pooled reserves. And I'm sure you've probably received a lot of questions, as have I.
Good point.
Well,
Yes.
are pooled reserves still allowed under the structural integrity reserve study requirement? And I would tell you that's a very good question. I would tell you that, in my opinion, there's a good argument that they are not allowed under the new law the way it's written now. I'm not going to go into the legal reasons why I say that, but that's my interpretation. And I'm hoping that we will have some clarification in that, in some of this glitch legislation, whether they're allowed or they're not allowed, just so people know.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very good point, and we have been receiving the same questions, and it's our reading too that at least this structural, since it's now broken apart into this structural component, that the pooled methodology is not going to be one that is going to be followed any longer. But again, that may require some clarification as well.
Right. Just to add on to that, the way we would handle something like that in the reserve world would be, we create the reserve study in such a way that, let's just say we were going to have 30 line items total. Let's say 10 of those line items are of the structural integrity nature, and the remaining 20 are not. Those remaining 20 could be irrigation system, carpets in the hallways, those kinds of things. We could theoretically break those into 2 separate pooled reserve study cash flow funding plans. So you're pooling for just the structural items, and you're also pooling for the non-structural items. The board would then take the sum of the 2 recommendations, and that's how you would come up with your 2023 reserve contribution. That's one way to handle that. But again, like the guy said, we don't know what they want us to do there. It can be done. We just need the clarification in order to model our software that way and be able to accommodate.
Great. And I think the other question that we had on the Q&A was someone who had joined a little late. I believe all attendees will get an email with a link to the presentation. One of the things I'd like to do just in closing is, unfortunately, due to this law, we've probably raised more questions than we've answered. And I think it begets all associations to really keep in touch with both their attorney and their reserve specialist, as well as their engineers, to keep monitoring this as changes may happen, over the next months to clarify. But again, please, the one thing that I would like to close with, and before I give over to my colleagues for their closing statement, is please don't wait. Everybody says, oh, it's December 31st, 2024. We got more than 2 years to deal with this. I've seen it too many times where somebody waits and they're out of luck and everybody's too busy, or the prices have gone up dramatically. Start planning for this. Even if you go to your engineers now or your reserve study, as Jason said, get on the wait list, get online. Okay, don't be stuck in November of 2024 with nowhere to turn and the report's due in a month. So with that said, I'd like to just turn it over first to Howard to give a few parting words, and then to Jason.
All right, thanks, Doug. First of all, thanks for having me on this seminar. Appreciate the opportunity. I would just say a couple of things. Again, I think we're in the midst of a perfect storm here. This new legislation with the milestone inspections and the reserve study requirements. Associations, number one, are going to have to pay for those studies. I'm seeing in the high-rise condominiums, and I'm sure Jason can address this, I'm seeing milestone inspection reports, $5,000 to $10,000. I mean, just obviously depends on the size of the building. And that's probably just for a phase one, not even a phase two. Then you got to throw in the structural integrity reserve study. We all know what's going on with insurance. Insurance premiums were going through the roof before Hurricane Ian. I guarantee you they're going nowhere but up after Hurricane Ian. So you're going to be facing significant increases in your insurance premium. All right. And so a lot of associations are going to say, well, look, we got this report we got to pay for. We got this report we got to pay for. We got the insurance premiums that are going up. We can't afford to increase our reserves at this time, regardless of what's going to happen. This is some of the feedback I'm getting. And I understand that. But again, come January 1st, 2025, you're going to have to do it whether you like it or not. My personal opinion, this is certainly not a legal opinion, my personal opinion, being involved in this industry for 35 years, start building up those reserves now, whether that hit over the next 3 years. Don't put your owners are going to be burdened over the next 3 years, period, no matter what. All right. Make it an equal burden. Don't give them a balloon payment, like a balloon payment on a mortgage. That would be my 2 cents. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Howard.
Well, thanks again. I just, again, want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's going to be a lot of education, I think, with the new, we are all still learning as the professionals in the industry about these new codes and what they want from us. So I can understand the frustration potentially of the individual homeowner or an association manager. So we're all in it together. We're here to help. We're going to try to limit as much as we can the financial strain on the individual owners. The one thing I definitely want to say, just to kind of reiterate, is try not to go a la carte with your selection of vendors, right? Especially, you guys mentioned it, the Miami-Dade, when you're doing 40 and 50-year certifications, and those are actually required. Let's just say, in a worst case scenario, you got to get a 40 or a 50-year certification done. Now you need a milestone and also a structural integrity study. Don't hire a firm just to do one and then say, oh yeah, we have to do the other. Oh yeah, we have to do that third one. If you can get a one-stop shop, that is going to be your best chance at saving on the fees side of it for the front end. And then the back end side of it, we are really going to have to sharpen our pencils on what we include in your reserve studies. We may be able to extract some things that we used to put in there. If, for example, an irrigation system is over $10,000, but it doesn't negatively affect the items listed in the A through I of the code, and we may be able to remove that and call it not, it's no longer defined as a reserve component because it doesn't have any impact on the roofs, the load bearing walls and whatnot. So there's things that we can do maybe to alleviate some of the things. We're going to be adding new things in for structural components. We may be able to remove some of the things that are non-structural in nature to help soften the blow of the funding recommendations. And that's pretty much all I've got.
Okay, Jason, thank you. Howard, thank you. I think we've gotten some great takeaways for something that's really going to be ruling associations' lives for the next few years.
Yep.
And we'll hopefully get some clarifications next year with the latest legislative session. But I think it's prudent information for all associations to forge ahead and not wait till the last minute. Thank you to all our attendees. We hope you've gotten some good takeaways from our discussion today. And our contact information is up on the screen. And if you'd like to get a hold of any of us with any other further questions, we'd be more than willing to help you out and answer those. Again, thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Good afternoon and be safe.